to John Korte's talk.
Good afternoon from virtual San Diego. Today I will attempt to provide you with a brief theological perspective regarding animal research, specifically vivisection. Ever since the fall, there has been a tension among mankind regarding man's relationship with animals. Historically, the greatest area of contention was the use of animals in research, i.e. vivisection. We have several definitions that we must look at before we start, and these are animal welfare and animal rights. Animal welfare holds the premise that humans have an ethical, moral, or religious-based obligation to treat animals well and not to inflict unnecessary pain or suffering on animals. Animal rights has a different premise. Animals are beings with a moral, ethical status, just like human beings, and that as a result, they should have not just the protection of the law, but be a part of the legal system with rights of their own. Throughout the history, the crux of the controversy surrounding animal research has been focused on how animals perceive pain. If, as humans, we are often reduced to describing pain on a subjective scale of 1 to 10, how can we assess pain accurately in animals if this is how we can only do it in humans? C.S. Lewis, a noted antivivisectionist, examined the problem of pain fairly successfully, but in humans could only conclude when we are speaking of creatures, we hardly know what we are talking about. So the question is, how do we define pain? Victoria has already defined pain for us in humans as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience that is associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in such terms. While there are many definitions for animal pain, one of the best was proposed by Kent and Malone in 2008. They stated that pain in animals is an adversive sensory experience that elicits protective motor actions, results in learned avoidance, and may modify species-specific traits of behavior, including social behavior. Since the 13th century, two major themes have predominated among Christians regarding the relationship with animals. These can be identified with Sir Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi. Aquinas focused on the fact that man was unique among the animals because of his special relationship with God. By extension, other animals were not rational and could not feel pain like humans. However, Thomas did not condone cruelty to animals, but their primary reason not to mistreat animals was basically homocentric, in that mistreating animals would cause one to develop a propensity to mistreat one's fellow man. St. Francis of Assisi proposed simply that since animals are part of God's creation, they, like all of God's creation, should be treated with dignity and respect. As the painting by Hogarth depicts, the Thomisan concept of cruelty to animals during childhood as the first step to more cruel behaviors as an adult was widely held. Philosophers such as Locke and Kant also ripped off this Thomisan concept. During the Renaissance, many vivisectionists initially justified their actions using the Thomistic approach of René Descartes, who considered animals to be soulless machines unable to feel pain like humans. However, the advent of utilitarianism enabled vivisectionists to amplify their rationale by not only minimizing the suffering the animals experience, but focusing on the benefit to mankind of their research. In other words, the greatest good produced for the least amount of bad. However, what is considered good or bad in most ethical situations is still highly subjective. So the decision regarding conducting medical research via vivisection basically boils down to a choice between the lesser of two evils. Since modern anesthesia was not introduced until the latter half of the 19th century, the early vivisectionists had only a few tools to alleviate their suffering. Mouly depicts in his painting the callous indifference of the observers to the plight of the dog, which it is difficult for us today to comprehend. The detachment of vivisectionists and others observed in this painting, is it really any different from the rationalization of other unethical actions throughout history? Medical research since the Renaissance has seen a nonstop advance in knowledge and treatments with many milestones along the way. These include Pasteur's development of the rabies vaccine in the 19th century, Salk and Sabin polio vaccines in the 20th century. Most of the modern medical advances have involved vivisection. Even the development of the COVID-19 vaccines last year, albeit based on molecular genetic techniques, was hampered by the shortage of primates. So how did vivisection become so controversial? Then as now, medical research was expensive, and it was difficult to obtain a benefactor. The scientists would stage exhibits to raise money. Robert Boyle, of Boyle's Law of Gases, was no different. Wright's painting portrays such an exhibition. As Boyle removed air from a chamber holding a bird, the reducing pressure first could no longer support flight and then caused the bird to collapse without air to breathe. After Boyle replaced the air, the bird would recover. Wright depicts the wide spectrum of public response to these demonstrations. Activist 19th century Christians did not suffer from a lack of causes confronting them. Abolition, women's suffrage, child welfare, and Darwinian evolution, to name a few. However, given the conditions under which animal experiments were conducted, it is no wonder many Christians could not condone vivisection and organized against it. Most animal welfare organizations were organized by Christians. One of the first was a group that ultimately became the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, organized by the noted abolitionist William Wilberforce and the Reverend Arthur Byrne, among others. Antivivisectionists also received literary support from a Quaker author, Anna Sewell, whose Black Beauty was extremely effective because it employed emphatic imaging to relate exploitation from the animal's perspective. It was also widely distributed to schools to influence public opinion. Most of the civil rights social justice movements began in Great Britain in the 19th century, and animal welfare was no exception. The first animal welfare law in Great Britain was the Martin Act of 1822, and by 1875, there was a realization that a law specific to vivisection was necessary. This led to the passage of the landmark Cruelty to Animals Act of 1876. It prohibited painful experiments in all vertebrates subject to certain exceptions, required facilities and personnel to be certified, and provided some transparency in the approval process for studies. This legislation has served as a cornerstone for all regulations regarding animal welfare worldwide. Many of these subsequent regulations were championed by concerned Christian scientists themselves. The scientists who were Christian themselves include the Guide for Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, institution of the 3 R's, refinement, replacement, reduction, and establishment of institutional animal care and use committees. One can safely say today that it is usually more onerous to obtain approval for an animal study than a clinical study. However, this does not mean that all vivisection is beyond reproach. The recent publication of research from China describing procedures enabling a male rat to give birth to viable offspring aptly demonstrates the fact that the only moral compass guiding some researchers is, if it can be done, it should be done. The 20th century has experienced a tremendous emphasis on medical research accompanied by steady improvements in the welfare of research animals. But in 1975, the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation refocused the animal welfare movement into an animal rights movement. Singer proposed a utilitarianism without anthropogenic bias, e.g., without speciesism. The resultant preferentialism gave all species equal consideration of interest. If Singer's work can be considered the animal rights movement's Declaration of Independence, then its constitution was Tom Reagan's The Case for Animal Rights, which gave the movement a moral relevance. However, the problem with speciesism is depicted in this slide. The exhibit at the London Zoo in 2005 was designed to demonstrate that man is an animal, just like all the other animals in the zoo. Accordingly, advocating that man has a special relationship to God and God's creation leaves animal rights at an ethical impasse with Christianity. Resultant controversy surrounding animal rights induced many mainstream denominations to re-examine their doctrines regarding animal care. A review of 7 revealed that all attempted to strike a balance between the Thomistic and Franciscan approach to animals. All accepted vivisection, albeit with certain conditions: minimize pain, necessary research, etc., etc. In other words, a classic animal welfare approach. The LCMS Commission on Theology and Church Relations published Together with All Creatures Caring for God's Living Earth. It, as did other denominations, tried to achieve a balance, but did conclude that God created us as creatures who bear a dignity and responsibility that is unique among all other creatures of the earth. While this Thomistic statement is self-evident to Christians, it is anathema to animal rightists who consider it speciesist. With a Lutheran background, Tom Regan understood why speciesism was as anathema to most Christians as dominion was to animal rightists. He joined forces with the Christian ethicist Andrew Linzey, an Anglican, to bridge the speciesism divide. Linzey, using unique interpretations of Scripture, has attempted to tilt the balance between being made in God's image and being part of God's creation drastically in creation's favor to justify animal rights. He calls this approach animal theology. Much of Linzey's writing are quite valuable and argue most favorably for the humane treatment of animals, and accordingly, he has been praised and honored by both philosophers and theologians. There is concern, however, with Linzey's emphasis on servanthood or priestly service as the overriding premise in support of animal rights. He writes, "It seems to me that Christians have an opportunity in the present circumstances to show what it means to live as though we believe in a generous, loving God by living that generosity toward others, non-human creatures." No one would disagree that man should strive to attain this Franciscan premise, but does it fully comply with the implications of God giving man dominion over his creation? As a Lutheran who believes that man can have multiple vocations, even with respect to animals, Linzey's approach is rather limited. David Clough, a Methodist, has written 2 volumes supporting animal rights from a Christian perspective that provide additional scriptural and philosophical confirmation of Linzey's animal theology. In Volume 1, Systemic Theology, Clough argues that one cannot have a coherent Christian theology without including a theology of animals. In Volume 2, Theological Ethics, Clough proposes a Christian ethic for the treatment of animals. Although his focus is much broader than vivisection, Clough, like Linzey, has done yeoman work advocating for the humane treatment of animals. Nevertheless, with regards to vivisection, Clough would have his cake and eat it too. His theology justifies his partaking of the past advances of modern science achieved by vivisection because the damage has already been done. But his theology does preclude any further vivisection, regardless of how humanity may benefit, because he can't condone the suffering of animals. Moreover, attempting to analyze the ethics of his argument brings us right back to our original conundrum regarding animal pain and suffering. Paraphrasing Lewis, when we are speaking of creatures, even after all these years, we hardly know what we are talking about. Thank you.
I guess I would say first I wanted to thank you. I had no idea when I read the book Black Beauty that was really put out there as a statement against animal cruelty. I didn't know that. I was just wondering, what are your personal thoughts on the appropriate balance between animal care and speciesism?
Between animal care and speciesism, okay, the balance, obviously I pretty much agree with what, I read about what the LCMS states on it, is that, we do have a responsibility. Dominion does not mean domination. It means caring response for the animals. So therefore, I'm an animal researcher from way back, and I've used many different species and many different types of research, and I feel that they were justified. I also felt like I tried very with very much difficulty make sure that these animals were not mistreated in any way.
Well, thanks very much, Don. I think we'll move on